I'm Jim Hessler. I'm the founder and president of Path Forward Leadership Development, and we're glad to have you with us this morning. The format is about 45 minutes of presentation material from me, followed by some open discussion. And as you have questions or comments, please go into the chat room. We're being joined today by my operations and marketing manager, Sarah Thompson. Sarah will be monitoring the chat room and making me aware of anything that we might want to talk about during the webinar. For many years, Path Forward we're in our 21st year of business, and it's always struck us how often the essential part of any organization comes down to the quality of conversations they're having. In fact, our tagline for our business is real challenges, real conversations, real results. And so what we're wanting to talk about today is a particular type of conversation to have with employees in your organization that we think is a good idea at all times, not just during a tight labor market. However, we are in a tight labor market. There was a headline, a front page article in the New York Times just the other day about it says the economic rebound is still waiting for workers. Now, these are US statistics, but there are 5 million fewer people in the workforce than there were before the COVID pandemic. And this is a quote from the article. The net result is that arguably for the first time in decades, workers up and down the income ladder have leverage, and they are using it to demand not just higher pay, but also flexible hours, more generous benefits, and better working conditions. A record 4.3 million people quit their jobs in August. And so, you know, we are in a tight labor market. This idea of a retention interview can be seen as partly a response to that labor market, but we'd rather have you see it as a practice to consider institutionalizing in your company and making a regular practice, and something that if you had started it a number of years ago might have actually helped you navigate these waters more effectively. So we offer this tool, this retention interview tool, to help you grow and maintain the depth of relationships with your customers and your teams. The retention interview is exactly what it sounds like. It's your attempt to get behind the wall that might separate you with your employees and find out what they're thinking about their future and the degree to which their future includes employment at your company. Now, for marketing purposes, and just so people can kind of get the gist of what a retention interview is about, we call it a retention interview, but I would argue, and you might want to make note of this, that a better name for it would probably be a partnership interview. And I'll make it a little bit more clear as we move on why I think that would be a good name for this process. So as you're branding and marketing this activity, this tool within your own organization, you might want to think of it as a partnership interview rather than a retention interview. So the driving force behind the conversation is to enhance the partnership between you and your employees, as opposed to simply figuring out how to hold them on, and keep them on the job. So most of you know who Path Forward is. We've been in business since 2001. We have over 3,000 graduates of our leadership workshop program, which is a 13-month program. And I'm a former senior executive in a Fortune 150 company. I have a lot of experience in corporate leadership, strategic planning. And our mission at Path Forward is to decrease suffering in the world by developing mature, principled, and effective leaders, and to enable this development through learning processes that are practical and relatable, and which create opportunities for immediate application. So that's enough of an advertisement, but that's who we are. That's what we believe. That's why we come to work in the morning, is to make people's lives better. And I think you'll see how the retention interview concept fits very nicely into that sense of mission about making people's lives better. So the context for the retention interview, obviously we're in a tight labor market. Retention isn't a new challenge, but we are in an unprecedented economy and labor market. Some disconnections between people have occurred due to virtual work requirements, and I'm sure a number of you are dealing with that. How do we keep our people close? How do we stay close to our people when we don't see them as much in person? So we've got that communication barrier in place that maybe we didn't have obviously before COVID. And it's always a good reminder to say any sort of recession creates turbulence, and a desire for change is often backlogged. So as we get into a turbulent environment like we have been, then people are less likely to make a change. And so when the fog starts to clear and the economy starts to stabilize, people then activate some ideas that they might have had that they were less likely to act on during the recession. And it's hard to say that we're in a recession anymore. Obviously, those of you who work for Expeditors, we have a number of people from Expeditors on the call. You're seeing that firsthand. I mean, there's still a lot of product moving. There's a lot of economic activity. It's just being done in a different way. And I think that, what we're seeing is potentially a pretty significant and permanent change in the nature of the relationship between employees and their companies. I don't think we can minimize that. I think that what has happened as a result of COVID is that people are asking different questions than they might have asked at one time about that relationship and what their expectations should be from that relationship and what they really want out of their work lives. And as people are doing this exploring and asking these questions that maybe they haven't asked before, the idea of the retention interview is for you to ask those questions with them, for you to be involved in that conversation in a respectful way, not in a way that's kind of desperate and hanging on, please don't leave, but rather, what are you thinking about? How is your nature, the nature of your relationship with our company and your job changing? And I would argue as an employer, you want to be part of that conversation. And that's again why the idea of the partnership interview comes up as I think about this tool. So I want to just mention quickly, loyalty is an interesting word for me. I don't discount the value of loyalty. However, I think it's probably a little bit overrated as a retention tool. We all like to have employees who are loyal to our businesses, and we like to think that they're going to stick around because of that characteristic or that quality of their personality, that they're loyal people. But loyalty doesn't exist in the form many employers believe it does. It's an unreliable predictor of employee mobility. And I would argue that the most loyal employees may be the ones that are actually least likely to talk about their concerns. Loyal employees tend to be people who want to feel good about where they are, who want to go to work and feel proud and affiliated and connected with the people that they work with. And because of that, it may actually be more difficult for these more loyal employees to talk about the fact that they might not be planning on being with your company. It might be more difficult to get through that loyalty almost becomes a barrier. And so I also like to say that loyalty looks backward and motivation looks forward. Some of you have been through our leadership workshop may have heard me say that I think there's a big difference between morale and motivation. And I think it's an important time to consider that. Somebody can have a pretty high level of morale and a pretty high level of loyalty to their employer. But we're finding now that doesn't necessarily keep people where they are. It's not a reliable indicator of their future plans or their future intentions. So the other message here is don't take anyone for granted, even those employees that give off the most loyal vibes and the most the strongest indications of wanting to stay. Don't take them for granted. Don't have a category of employees that you consider as high risk employees and are at risk for flight, and then have another category where you say, well, you know, we're probably okay with these people. They're likely to stay. I would not make any assumptions about any employee at this point in terms of their future plans. And again, the retention interview or the partnership interview is a tool to bring all of that right up front, where it can be discussed and it can be addressed in the employee relationship. So, you know, what should we be doing to retain our talent? You know, clearly, we're not here today to talk about the externals, what you should pay people, what your benefit package should look like. You know, work rules around working from home as opposed to working in the office. That's not what this webinar is about. However, those are obvious concerns, and I assume and hope that you're all working on those issues diligently, because again, people, this is an employees market. This is somebody described the current situation as being like everybody in the workforce is part of a giant union right now, and they have bargaining power that they didn't used to have. So you're going to have to react to that. I don't have any recommendations in that regard, but obviously that's part of the equation. There's another part too that I don't think that many of my clients have done enough with. Some done very well, but I think it's a time to think about internal marketing and branding. I think the question is, how do you talk to your employees about your company's mission? How do you brand the company to potential employees as well as to potential customers? A lot of companies have marketing programs that are almost entirely directed at future customers. This might be a time to redirect some of that marketing and branding effort towards future employees. I think you know, if you watch television or you're on the internet, I think you're starting to see companies do that. There's something that's not on this sheet, but I think is also important, is if you haven't had a diligent effort in your company to build out your networks, your managers' networks, I would also argue this is an excellent time to put a focus on that. I'll actually kind of single out, if you don't mind, the folks at Expeditors. I'm on LinkedIn connections with many Expeditors employees. Many Expeditors employees have little or no impact when it comes to LinkedIn. So you might want to get your team together and say, how are we seen? How visible are we in the marketplace in a way that helps us attract talent? And then, you know, points 3 and 4 on this slide really, you know, slide into the retention interview concept, which is the idea of exploring with each employee their motivations to stay or to consider leaving, and then diving more deeply into the non-transactional elements of the employee's experience. So the transactional elements are pay, benefits, work hours, those sorts of things. We want to dive into how they feel about their work, their career. Are they on the path that they hope to? Is there a way to get them redirected or directed in a more exciting or dynamic way? These are things we have to take into deep consideration. I think a lot of employers are scrambling to address the externals, the pay, the benefit, work rules, et cetera, without including the interpersonal connection that may actually be as important or more important than those externals are. We know from research, the Buckingham and Coffee book, for example, First Break All the Rules. We know that the relationship each employee has with their direct supervisor and, you know, arguably other peers and people in the organization is a direct connection. And in fact, the strongest predictor of workplace satisfaction. So the retention interview is a way for the managers of people in your organization to take a greater level of responsibility for building that relationship. And it's a unique way. It's not certainly the only way to develop that relationship, but it's I think a good one. So we're looking to get clarity on expectations with people. We're also looking for help to have our employees think out loud with us about their feelings. So sometimes when you ask direct questions, how are you feeling about your work experience? Do you plan to stay? Things like that. You're going to find that by doing so, you're helping the employee process their own feelings, and you're bringing things to the surface that they may not have articulated or thought about. So this is in the nature of just asking great questions. You know, I'm a kind of a professional facilitator, and so much of what I do in my work is ask good questions. So what you're really doing in the retention interview is asking good questions and then diligently listening. So let's get into that a little bit more. So what is a retention interview? A retention interview, or a partnership interview, as I've suggested, is a scheduled informal dialogue in which employees are asked to share their feelings about their relationship with their job and with the organization. It's an exploration of the whys. You know, why might you want to stay? Why might you consider leaving? It's an opportunity to collect insight that could lead to a more engaging employee experience. What might need to change? What could make things better for you here? What would make this, if you are considering leaving, what might we be able to work in partnership together to change that would increase the likelihood of you staying here over the long term. And this next point might be the most important one on this slide, which is this conversation is an exploration. It's not a persuasion. Please don't conduct the retention interview with the idea that you're persuading the person to stay. That's not really how this conversation works. If you bring somebody into a room and you have a list of all the reasons why they should stay, I don't think that's going to be a very interesting conversation. It's certainly not going to be a two-sided conversation. So make sure that the nature of this dialogue is to listen to the employee non-judgmentally. When they tell you that they have concerns about one thing or another in the workplace, don't tell them why they're wrong about that. Don't argue that point. Just soak that information in, take it in, listen, and consider the value of what they're saying to you as a manager or a coworker, and what you've just learned about that person that might be essential to your ongoing relationship with them. So again, those of you who've been through my leadership workshop will know that we do, you know, I believe we do too much telling. I think we do too much persuading. This is why you should be happy with your job. This is why you shouldn't leave. This is, you know, why you're ungrateful, you know, for all the wonderful things that we provide for you. You know, this is why I love working here, and you should love working here for the same reasons I do. None of those are helpful or appropriate in a retention interview conversation. You're not selling anything here. You're engaging in a conversation, which is quite different. So a retention interview, I think back to the original interview that you might have done with this person to bring them on board. What kinds of questions were you asking in that discovery? What were you wanting to know about them as human beings before you brought them on your team, before you considered their culture fit and their aptitude? This mirrors that in terms of the depth that it drives to. You really want to know what's going on with this person, and you're going to spend the time to do it. So these interviews could be quite lengthy if you really ask the right kinds of questions and dive in. Some principles behind the retention interview, or again, the partnership interview, is very simple. The best way to understand your employees' future intentions is to ask them directly about those intentions. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. Another principle is that an honest and substantive outreach deepens the employee-employer relationship, regardless of any other purpose. I think one of the things you would have to ask yourself is, if you're going to institute this type of interview process, is what do you do with the employee who says, yeah, I don't see myself here 3 years from now, right? You can't just drop it there. There has to be some other follow-up or something that happens from that. So be thinking about that. But the bottom line is, this is always a good idea. Again, I want to just stress, we're not just doing this in response to a tight labor market. We're not just doing this in response to our fear about losing employees, but we're doing it because it's really the right thing to do, even in good times. We've had clients do these kinds of retention interviews, years ago, before the labor market shifted the way it has. And they found that even in a market that wasn't as labor friendly, that there was tremendous value in doing these interviews. There's also the surprise factor. I think companies are often surprised. I know I have been in my management and executive career. A couple times I got completely surprised by somebody leaving. I had no idea they were thinking about leaving. And how helpful would it have been if I'd known that they were thinking about leaving and had an opportunity to possibly mitigate that, or even just on a very personal level, help them and the company make the transition more effectively, rather than just getting a 2-week notice and off they go. The last point is, employees, if approached with respect and curiosity, will most likely honor the process with honesty. One of the first questions that people ask as we bring up the concept of this retention interview is, are people really going to tell you the truth? We've been continuously surprised at the degree to which people actually seem anxious to talk about this with their employer. So I think you have to extend some trust in this process. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on. Trust will show up. If you have high trust with the employee, that will show up in these kinds of conversations. If trust is low, then that will show up as well. That lack of trust will show up. It'll be a more guarded conversation. It will be, gee, why is Jim asking me these questions all of a sudden? I know he's never asked them before. And again, this is why it's so important to make this a regular practice with employees, rather than something that's event driven. We don't want people to think, well, Jim's talking to me, Jim's having this conversation with me to serve his own purposes, to prevent me from leaving, because that would be an inconvenience for him. And that's a lack of trust, right? So if we don't have trust, and the employee doesn't answer questions honestly in this sort of a dialogue, then you probably have other problems that need to be addressed. There's clearly a fundamental issue with an employee relationship if you can't trust them, or they don't trust you in these types of conversations. So you may find as you conduct these retention interviews, that in many cases they serve to build trust, but they may in other cases indicate that trust is lacking, and then that's something that you need to work on, maybe outside of the retention interview process, and think about the employee relationship that way. The other thing too is, when we conduct the retention interview, I don't think you should look at it as what I would call a binary outcome. Okay, so I'm Jim, I've interviewed Sarah. Now I can check the box that says, okay, good, Sarah's staying, or check the box that said, oh, oops, she's leaving. this might not be a binary outcome. You might not be able to clearly indicate this is somebody who's going to stay or this is somebody who's going to leave. There's probably going to be a lot of gray area that have come out of this conversation that you should be comfortable with, right? So don't ask people to categorically say, yes, I'm staying, or no, I'm not staying, but rather, again, explore why they might stay and explore why they might not stay. And what are the motivations and the concerns and the things they love about their job, the things they don't love about their job, and how that factors in. Oops. So again, it's a regular practice. It's not enacted solely in response to current challenges. It's non-judgmental. It's confidential. We'll talk about that as well. Driven by genuine curiosity on the part of the interviewer and the organization. It explores the employee's relationship with the organization. I'm going to argue that the confidentiality should be strong in these conversations, that individual comments should not be shared outside of these conversations. If you as an organization want to collect data from retention interviews, if you want to say, for example, 40% of our employees are expressing a significant concern about staying, I think it's okay to collect that data as a number or as a ratio or a percentage, but I'd be careful to share it anything about an individual conversation. So be careful about the messages you send to people about the purpose of the interview, and make sure that they know who, if anybody, will see the results. So let's talk about some example questions. We can, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of this presentation, and I'd like to get your suggestions on this as well. Here's just some questions that indicate the kind of the tone and tenor of the types of questions that you would ask. So imagine yourself with your employee and you asking, as you look into your future, do you see yourself working here in 3 years? Why yes, and why no? What would you change about your work experience here if you had the opportunity? Now, that doesn't mean you can address all these concerns. It doesn't mean you can do everything the employee suggests as they answer this, but at least you know what the gap is, right? And now you know what the gap is between what they would like to have out of their work experience and what they're currently getting. In general, do you feel you're treated well by this organization? What are the things the organization does that makes you feel better or worse about the future of the company? And is there anything you might do that would make your work experience more engaging? So these are questions that I think are often asked in performance reviews. However, I argue that these should be separated from the performance review. I think you might look at these questions and say, hey, I can just fold these into my performance review or my regular feedback sessions. I'd say no. I think the performance review is more, it's more transactional. It's more me directing observations and data and suggestions to you. And I think these sorts of questions are better asked outside of that context. So this isn't about their performance. This conversation is not about their performance. This is about their relationship with the company and their feelings about staying. That's very different from giving them feedback about their abilities or their performance or their future potential. So please keep these conversations separate. I would argue strongly in favor of keeping these out of the performance review or feedback process, and keep these conversations squarely in the context of an exploration, a partnership, and an opportunity for the interviewer to learn and to truly listen rather than to evaluate or judge the responses, to truly listen. And we know very well how good an employee feels when they're actually listened to. And we also know how disaffecting and disengaging it is when they don't feel they're being listened to. So keep this separate from performance review. It's a different conversation. It's geared towards an entirely different outcome. And so keep that in mind. So one of the things we get into is the question of, who should conduct the interview. So there's some mechanics here in terms of who's the interviewer and who's the best choice to have this conversation. Option one is the individual's boss or supervisor. And there's advantages and disadvantages to each one of these choices. I'm going to present three options, and you may have others that we can talk about later. So if a person can sit down with their direct report or even their peer and have this conversation, then the advantages are that provides more opportunity to discuss real-time and specific issues. So people can compare notes more effectively in this sort of conversation because they work together regularly, and they can get into specifics about things that are working and not working for that employee. It does create the potential for that relationship to deepen. And of course, we've already talked about how important the nature of that relationship is to the employee's plans. It provides useful feedback to the boss. It may allow the boss to identify some areas where they haven't been as responsive or aware or tuned in to the employee needs and issues. And it may give the boss immediate ideas for mitigation. So I think maybe ideally this conversation can take place between a boss and an employee. There may be reasons why that doesn't work as well, and we'll get into a couple of other options. The disadvantage to this approach is if the boss is the problem, meaning if the boss is the reason why the person might be considering leaving the company, and that's often the case, that could be a stifled dialogue. It could be very difficult for an employee to say, the reason I'm thinking about leaving the company is because I don't like working for you. Now, it's possible that sort of directness and honesty could even arise in this sort of a conversation, but it's also possible that it won't. And so the boss may have a tendency to want to protect themselves. To the other point here is the boss may be hesitant to share data or information that makes them look bad. So there's no ideal partner for this partnership interview. I think there's different degrees of value that you get from each one of them. If I'm running a company, I would like to think that every one of my managers has the skill and orientation to have this sort of a conversation with their employees. And if you do have managers that do that well and do it consistently, then I think you can trust them with the retention or partnership interview. But there may be circumstances in which you have a less experienced manager, a manager who hasn't been working with the employee for a long time, and you might want to consider other options. So what are those other options? An internal third party. So this would be somebody other than the individual's direct manager. People other than the boss, the person's boss might be more skilled or experienced in these sorts of conversations. You might want to have a very experienced and kind of wise senior person to conduct these interviews. And the employee may feel freer to express their concerns to that third party as opposed to talking directly to their boss about it. The disadvantages is the feedback from the interview might be difficult to share from peer to peer. So if Sarah is a manager in my company and I'm a manager in my company, and I talk to one of her employees and find out something about her that's a concern, then there's some sensitivity about now what happens between me and that person's boss to give them information, again, without sharing too many confidentialities. So this really, if you use an internal third party, I would be careful not to have it that I'm going to report back to you about what your employee said, but rather I'm going to act in the role of a coach to that individual and maybe give them some ideas about how to improve their work situation. And then, like we said too, maybe I'm collecting data, right? I've conducted 15 of these conversations, and five people seem anxious to leave, or whatever. And then the impact might be lessened if this is seen as an HR initiative rather than a committed outreach from frontline managers. I actually generally don't like the idea that these sorts of interviews would be conducted by human resources. In fact, I think there's some really particular problems with that, because too often the responsibility for dealing with unhappy employees or disgruntled employees is shoved off to the HR department, and it really takes it out of. I think you lose the spirit of the retention partnership interview if you foist it off on your HR people. So I recommend against that, and you can make your own choice on that. And then you could use an external third party. You could use somebody like me, or an executive coach that works with your business, or a trusted third party. The advantage is there, you get a lot of consistency in the interview techniques. So if one person or several people are doing all the interviews, then the interviews are going to be conducted in a very consistent way, which might be more difficult if you're doing it through your managers. Trust in the confidentiality from the employee's perspective might be higher if they're talking to a third party rather than to one of their own company employees. It might help with the time commitment for the managers who may in many cases have quite a few of these interviews to conduct. And then the results in this case could be shared confidentially with the bosses. So now again, back to that example, if Sarah is working for your company and I'm a third party, then after I interview Sarah's people, I can go to Sarah and give her more direct feedback about what I'm hearing from her employees. And I think it's easier for that to come from a third party because that can stay confidential between the two of us, and it isn't company information. Rather, it's kind of information that's shared within the context of a coaching relationship. Obviously, the disadvantages are cost. When you involve a third party, you're going to have to pay them to do that, and the results might not be taken as seriously as if the conversations happen within the company. So those are what I see as three options. Again, it's just a sit-down interview. There's no, I don't think you need to have a really strong template for it. I think it's a series of questions. It's a relaxed environment, and you just need to decide who's going to do the interview and how, if the information from the interviews is shared with others. These are really important questions to ask before you start doing these interviews. Otherwise, they might lose support from the people that they're intended to help. Some of you will recognize this. These are things that come out of our book, Land on Your Feet, Not on Your Face. The Expeditors people know this is the leadership platform, same book with different title. And one of the planks on our platform, we talk about the 6 shovels of motivation. And these are probably really useful things to keep in mind as you're having these retention interviews. We're looking for fit. Is the person just a good natural fit with the position that we're asking them to occupy? Have we created meaning? Is there something that they feel is meaningful about their job over and above the practical considerations of pay, et cetera? connection. How do people feel about their social bonds and their interpersonal bonds with the people that they work with? Growth. Do they feel that they're advancing themselves in some significant way, not only as professionals, but as individuals, as a process of working there? Self-determination. Do they feel they have a voice? Do they feel like their opinions matter? Do they feel like management acts on the things that they're concerned about? And context. Do they understand the big picture? Often employees will drift away from their relationship with their organization because they don't feel like they're part of anything that's bigger than themselves. So these are, I included these in this presentation because I imagined if I'm sitting having one of these retention partnership interviews, that these would be good concepts for me to keep in mind. What is the person telling me about their sense of meaning in their job? What is the person telling me about their sense of their social connections? What are they telling me about how they feel about their growth potential within the organization? So these just, I think, would be really good concepts to keep in mind as you're conducting these interviews. So what I'd like to do is invite you to ask questions. This is the end of the formal webinar presentation, and now we can get into at least kind of a Q&A scenario. I don't think we'll open up for you to be on screen and ask your question verbally, but please go into the chat room, and we have a couple already. Yeah, Steve Clinton. Steve's in Yakima, Washington. Steve says, I seem to remember from our leadership class, Steve went through it with another employer, that a high percentage of people have or leave their jobs as a way to fire their boss. A, is my memory correct? And B, if that was true, is it still true in today's environment? Yeah, great question. Number one, yes, you do remember that correctly. There's really been some significant data that's been collected on people's reasons for leaving the job. And the idea that they didn't like the person they were working for or didn't feel connected to the person they're working for is still very much a consideration. Now, is that still true in today's environment? Yes, but I think there may be other things that are entering into the equation that are also becoming powerful motivators. Do I get to work from home? Do I have to come into the office? Do I have other opportunities now that this is an employee's market? Should I be shopping around more? So yeah, Steve, I think that we should still put that relationship in a very central place in terms of its importance to the employee's relationship with the company, but also understand that there are other factors that may now actually trump that, meaning that somebody could feel really good about their boss and still leave. And, and that's always been the case. I mean, no matter how much you like your boss, there may just be something else that you need to do or want to do instead. So I hope that answers the question. And then Steve followed up and he says, should that influence who should conduct the interview? Yeah, we talked about that some in terms of the choice, and this can get to be, fairly delicate. Steve, if you're concerned about that, that might be an argument for you to have an internal third-party interview where the employees are talking to somebody other than their direct supervisor, or a third party. There may be an opportunity for a breakthrough conversation here too. I'm not going to say it's always going to happen, but if you allow the boss to conduct the interview, it may provide an opportunity that employee and that boss have not had before to talk about what they really want to talk about or need to talk about with each other that they haven't been talking about. But you're right. If the boss is the reason that the person leaves, I guess the fundamental question is, how do we find out that that was the case? Unfortunately, exit interviews are kind of unreliable in that regard. because the employee generally isn't going to throw their boss under the bus and say, I left because Jim, and Jim's a terrible boss. So how do we find that out? And clearly we need to find that out. We need that information. We need some way of knowing how the employee feels about their direct relationship with their supervisor. And if we don't have that information, then we'll continue to be surprised when they leave. So, Steve, I'd love to talk to you offline. By the way, we're just going to keep this, after we get done with the formal part of this at 10 o'clock, we're just going to keep the Zoom call open. And then at that point, if you want to engage in additional conversation, please stay on the call and we can actually talk voice to voice about some of this stuff. Don at Exotic says, can a copy of this presentation be emailed? And Sarah has responded by saying everybody should receive a copy of the deck and the recording. So yes, by virtue of you signing on for this, you will get a copy of the recording of the call of the webinar. Jonathan, hi Jonathan. Should this be its own meeting, or would you suggest weaving these questions into a performance review? I think I made that clear earlier. I would say it's a separate conversation. I would say strongly that it's a separate conversation. I think when an employee enters into a performance review conversation, there's all kinds of defenses that are up. There's all kinds of anxiety, I think, about those conversations. I'd like to strip that away and have this conversation unburdened by that. So very strongly feel that this retention partnership interview should be a separate conversation that's not that, and do not attempt to include it in your performance review process. Nevis, I think I'm pronouncing your name. Nice to see you again, Nevis. Enjoyed meeting you in London some years ago. What about the risk to become a sort of psychologist for people? I mean, is there a risk to touch privacy maybe? Do we need to put limits on the interview? I guess a great question. Thank you. I think I've always argued or carried the assumption with me that a good manager is in part a psychologist. I think people don't want to be psychologists for their employees, but a big part of management is understanding human beings, understanding them as individuals, and understanding things like cultural influences and structural influences in the company on people's behavior. So I think if you're really managing people effectively, I think you're already a psychologist. Now, clearly, if there's issues in the person's personal life, substance abuse issues, things that are going on at home, I think there are probably some lines that you don't want to cross, and I think you can use your own judgment about that. But in terms of finding out how people really feel about things and exploring who they are and what their motivations are, I think that's a natural, and I would argue required part of management. And if you don't enjoy human psychology, then I don't think you can really enjoy leading people. I think the two go hand in hand. So I'd be curious if anybody else has any other comments on that. What does that next message mean?
She's just confirming where you met. That's all.
Okay. All right. Kevin in Portland says, assuming best to do these one-on-ones, say two-on-one, asking in terms of training people on how to do these conversations. It takes some skill, empathy to do this correctly. At times it might be useful for someone to sit in and learn, but fear that might limit discussion. Yeah, I can see doing these as a three-person in the room conversation. And you're right, Kevin. It might be really good if you feel like a manager doesn't have experience or sophistication or nuance in some of these conversations. It might be really good for them to observe someone who is. So yeah, I think you can make a good argument that a manager plus an internal or external third party in the room could be a very good combination for these interviews. And especially if the third person is a senior facilitator, a skilled interviewer. So yeah, I would say that's entirely possible and maybe actually a really good idea in many cases for these conversations. So any additional questions? Anything you'd like to say about this webinar and how we can make this type of webinar more effective for people? What's your takeaway? If a couple people could just come in and say, here's my biggest takeaway from this webinar. And by the way, back to Kevin's point, if you want to talk more structurally about, kind of how actually to set up the interviews and train people how to do them, I'd be glad to talk to anybody about that offline. So, this webinar is also an invitation. So just, contact me and let me know if you want to talk about this further. I'd be glad to do it. We're not getting more messages in the chat, so I don't want to hold you any longer. We said this would be done in an hour. We're beating that. Oh, Priscilla, thank you. Appreciate the emphasis on listening to understand versus analyze. Yeah, thank you. Any other comments you'd like to leave before you sign off the call would be appreciated. Any comments to me separately, jimh@pathforwardleadership.com is my email. So if you want to say something to me offline and through email, I'd be glad to hear that as well. Again, I'm not giving you a really specific blueprint about how to do these. I'm giving you some philosophy. I'm giving you an encouragement, I think, to have these conversations. And I'm leaving it up to you guys to I think, figure out some of the mechanics of it. But the philosophy behind these interviews is, I think, the most important part of this conversation. Why are we doing them? And are we really going to be listeners? Are we really going to engage in a two-way dialogue, as opposed to selling somebody on why they should want to stay? That again, if you start doing that, the conversation will fall apart very quickly. So, all right, I'm just getting a lot of thank yous at this point, and my thank yous back to you guys for attending. We're going to be doing more of these types of webinars, and we'll keep you posted, and hope to see you, many of you, join these webinars in the future. We'll try to keep them brief like this. If anybody wants to continue the conversation, just say so. But otherwise, for those of you that want to get back to your regular work day, thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.